All right. So the last formal topic will be the circulatory system. We'll talk about um, this is how the role of the circulatory system. What it's made of, and actually it's kind of neat because it ties together in really nicely with what we did before, which we're looking at respiratory system and the digestive system. So I wrote that this is a unifying system because if you remember, from the point of view of the organism needing oxygen and nutrients, um, oxygen coming in from the respiratory system and nutrients coming in from the digestive system, the circulatory system is what moves it around. But just keep in mind, not everything has a circulatory system. Some things are small enough that they can get away without having one. And I think we talked about that before. Not all animals have systems, but we are going to focus on the ones that do have systems, okay? So a circulatory system is made up of three things. Um, three things being blood, blood vessels, and a heart. Those are the three parts that make up a circulatory system. So, for example, something like an earthworm, okay, you can see that in this video, this diagram, you can see the blood vessels. So in the blood vessels, there would be blood, and there would be some sort of a pumping mechanism. Now, in this case, you see these things called contractile blood vessels. We have one organ, the heart, that does the pumping for us. The earthworm has like multiple little mini hearts that do that. But the idea is, for a circulatory system to work, you need the three things. You need blood vessels, blood, and you need some sort of a pump to move the blood around. Okay. All right. So what does our system do? Well, we already talked about two things. One is to move around nutrients and to move around oxygen. That's what we've been talking about, right? In terms of, the digestive system moves around, brings in the nutrients, and the respiratory system brings in the oxygen, and the circulatory system moves that around. But then, think about with gas exchange, we bring in oxygen, but we got to get rid of carbon dioxide. So the circulatory system is also responsible for moving around waste, so we can get rid of it. Now it has other roles too. You can see that it plays a role in regulating body temperature. It plays a role in immunity, and these are things that you'll learn more about, in like senior biology in terms of how it actually works. Now, in terms of the circulatory system, we said it's made up of three things. So let's go through these things. Okay, so first, it's made up of blood. In that blood, it's mostly water, but there are some special cells. We actually talked about already some of these cells. And some of these special cells, for example, are things like red blood cells. These are erythrocytes, so they're called. And if you remember, we talked about them as an example of a specialized cell. These are things that are, kind of flat. They're round, so they can move through your bloodstream really nicely. There's a black and white image of that. Remember, they don't have any mitochondria because, mitochondria use up oxygen, and we want them to move around oxygen. So a really important cell that makes up blood are your red blood cells, but it's not the only cell, right? We talked about, if you remember this slide, that your blood also contains platelets. So platelets are these funny shaped cells. These are involved in blood clotting. This is actually an image of blood clotting. So you see all these little fibers that are forming. These little fibers, these fibers form when you have a blood clot that's being created. Because what happens is if a blood vessel gets damaged, blood starts leaking out. You want, in that case, to stop the leak. So you're going to need cells that actually have funny shapes so that they actually will get stuck together and form like a barrier. So these platelets that have an unusual shape will actually get stuck together along with this mesh. This is called fibrin. That would actually start to seal the wound so you don't keep bleeding. So we have red blood cells, we have platelets, but also we have the white blood cells. They're called leukocytes. That's their actual name. So they're called leukocytes. All right, and you'll learn more about that when you do the immune system in grade 12, if you take grade 12, if you take grade 12 biology, of course. So you know that their role is to keep you healthy. They basically look for things that shouldn't be there, or maybe cells that are damaged, and try to get rid of them. So the blood, we know, is mostly made out of water. We talked a little bit about that when we did osmosis, and we talked about types of cells in blood. It also, we know the circulatory system also has, not only does it have blood, but it also has blood vessels, right? Just 3 types. Arteries, veins, and things called capillaries, or some people say capillaries. Arteries are the thickest ones, and the reason why is because they're under the most pressure, because their job is to move blood away from the heart. So what happens is when your heart pumps blood, it forces the blood into the arteries. So the arteries are under extreme pressure. So they have to be really, really thick. So here's a nice cross section of an artery. You can see that the artery wall is very, very thick because it's under the most amount of pressure. Here's a nice diagram showing you the 3 different types of blood vessels. So veins are actually the widest, but their walls are not as thick as the walls of an artery, because the blood in an artery is under more pressure because the heart is actually squeezing the blood into the arteries, whereas the veins bring blood back to the heart, so they're under a little bit less pressure. Now, you'll learn more about that in grade 11 biology when you really delve into blood pressure. The difference in things like systolic and diastolic blood pressure. So I don't want to say too much about that. This is something that you will learn more about in biology. But if you remember, I think we talked about a theme in science, a pretty important theme that I like to talk about quite often is something called form and function. And this kind of relates to the idea that when you look at something in biology, that its form, the shape that it has, or its physical features tell you something about what it does. Like, for example, if we ask the question, why are arteries the thickest? Well, that would make sense now because arteries are the thickest because the heart pumps blood into the arteries. It forces the blood into the arteries. So the arteries are under extreme pressure, which explains why their form is, to have thick walls, right? Whereas if you look at something like capillaries, well, capillaries actually came up in digestion and in gas exchange. Because if you remember, in gas exchange, the alveoli, which are these little bubble-like structures, in the villi, which are little finger-like projections, they have blood vessels that are close to the surface of these membranes, these objects, these alveoli and these villi. And the blood vessels that are there are the capillaries. Now, why capillaries? Because if you recall, the job of the alveoli is to allow the oxygen to get into the bloodstream. And the job of the villi is to allow for the nutrients to get into the bloodstream. And the reason why we want to use capillaries is because they have the thinnest walls. And you remember, diffusion is slow, right? So when the walls are very thin, things can diffuse through them or out of them, right? So we can't have diffusion through arteries and veins because those blood vessels are just too thick. So whenever you hear that there's a diffusion going through blood vessels, like in respiration or in digestion, those blood vessels that are having diffusion, that things can diffuse through them, those are capillaries. Okay, they're not veins, not arteries, they're capillaries. Now, the connection between then the three vessels is arteries. So an arteriole is just a smaller artery, and a venule is a smaller vein. But the way it's looped together is that blood leaves the heart through arteries. The blood then goes into capillaries and then returns through the veins back to the heart. So if you had to draw like a kind of like a simple diagram, the way it would look is this is the heart. Sorry, like a flow chart. The heart moves the blood into the arteries. The arteries then move the blood into the capillaries. So for example, in your lungs, the capillaries would pick up oxygen and get rid of carbon dioxide. In your digestive system, like your small intestine, the capillaries would pick up nutrients. Then those capillaries would bring the blood to the veins. And then the veins would take the blood back to the heart. All right, that's the way, this is the way blood flows through an organism that has hearts, that has a heart, a pump, blood, and blood vessels. Here's a beautiful picture of the heart. You can see actually the two blood vessels. Again, you can see, if I look, you will notice that here, so here's a vein, and there's an artery. You can see the artery is just narrower but thicker. If I look at the walls of the artery, you can see that it's thicker than the walls of the vein. Okay. Now, if I, so this is a beautiful picture showing you the two different blood vessels here. Okay, so we talked about blood, talked about blood vessels. The third part of any circulatory system is the heart. This is what actually moves the blood around the organism, right? And we just talked about the way that it flows, right? Heart, arteries, capillaries, veins, back to the heart. The heart is a pump. You think of it as a pump. If you remember, we talked about tissues that make up organs. So the heart contains obviously connective tissue to hold it together, but the most important tissue in the heart is muscle tissue because muscles contract. Specifically, it's called cardiac muscle. We talked about that when we looked at examples of tissue. We're not going to go into too much detail about the way the heart is divided because you'll learn more about that again in grade 11 biology. But the heart is actually divided into chambers, and there's a reason for that. But again, I'm not going to go into detail in grade 10 about that. We'll talk about that in grade 11. Here is actually, I should mention one thing. I will mention what this means. This is kind of a cool term, so I will mention it. The heart is actually referred to as myogenic, and what that means is that it actually can generate its own contraction. Now, if you remember, we talked about different types of tissue. Muscle tissue contracts, but if you remember, we ended up talking about nerve tissue at the end. And the way it works is that nerve tissue controls muscle tissue. So when nerves fire messages, the muscles contract. Now, in this case, the cardiac muscle, which is myogenic, actually generates its own contraction. So I guess what that means is that, those movies when you watch someone like pull the heart out of another person and they're holding it and it's beating. It actually will do that for a little while, of course, not forever, because then eventually there's no blood flow and the heart will just die. But the heart can actually generate its own contraction. Now, the nervous system does regulate how fast it contracts. So the nervous system does have some sort of control there, but it actually generates its own contraction. Here is an image of the fish heart. It's made up of actually two chambers. Here is a heart from a frog. It's made up of 3 chambers. You can see that actually here. Here's 1 chamber, here's 2, here's 3. And then here is a bird. So if you look at the bird, it actually has 4 chambers. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4. Our heart kind of looks like this. Actually also has 4 chambers, which you can see here. 1, 2, 3, 4. You can also see it in this diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll talk about the significance of that in grade 11. There's an advantage to having 4 chambers as opposed to 3, and there's an advantage of having 3 as opposed to 2. There are some big advantages to having more chambers in the heart and having it divided in this way. But I'm not going to really go into that detail in grade 10. So stay tuned for that when you get to grade 11. What we also find in the heart are really important features. Not only is the heart, now in this case, this is like a mammalian heart, but remember the bird heart also has 4 chambers. So we can see that the heart has other features. For example, you'll notice that the heart is also got a wall in between. So you can see that right here. There's a wall that actually divide. Sorry, what's going on here? Let's try that again. Okay, there's a big wall right here that divides the heart. So this will be the left side of the heart, and this is the right side. So you would be looking at it from the other side, basically, right? If you're looking at it this way, imagine that this is the heart. This heart was in your body, so you would be looking at it as if you were looking in the mirror. So in the mirror, left and right are reversed. So this big wall actually separates the left side from the right side of the heart. And the reason why it does that is actually you can see really nicely in this picture. You'll notice that here on the left, so if again, here's that wall in between. So this is the left side, and then this is the right side of the heart. This is the left side, right side. You'll notice that there's all this red. Now, what does red mean? Red means oxygen-rich blood. So this blood on the left side of the body has a lot of oxygen, and on the right side of the body, it's blue. Now, it's actually not really blue. This is just color enhanced. What it would actually look like is just dark red, but that means that there's very little oxygen on the right side of the heart. And that's because your heart is actually divided into 2 parts. So one side of the heart has a job, and its job is to send blood to your lungs. Obviously, that would be this side, because on this side, the blood is oxygen poor. So the right side of the heart, its job is to send blood to the lungs, right, to the lungs. Whereas the left side, its job is to receive that oxygen-rich blood from the lungs. Remember, the lungs, you pick up oxygen, right? Its job on the left is to get that oxygen from the lungs and then send it to the rest of your body. So you can see that the 4-chambered heart is actually divided. The left side has a different role than the right side. That's why we see the color difference between the left side and the right side. In terms of their roles, you can probably see that. Let me just skip over this for now, okay? You can see that here. So these are actually different pathways that I'm showing you. Here is an image of the heart. So I'm going to come back to that, okay? But what I'm talking about that division of labor between the left side and the right side is this. So here we have that division again. So there's that wall. All right. So here's the left side of the heart, left side. There's the right side. The job of the left side of the heart is to take the oxygen-rich blood, which is often you see it as a bright red color, and move that to your body. Okay, so you can see, you follow the arrows, you can see that the left side brings blood out into those arteries. Remember, arteries are under a lot of pressure. Send blood up to your brain and send blood down to the rest of your body. So in other words, up to your head and then or below, right? Send oxygen-rich blood everywhere, basically. That blood we know goes into the capillaries. You can see the capillaries. Remember, capillaries connect arteries and veins. What happens in the capillaries is the oxygen diffuses out, and then the carbon dioxide, it diffuses in. Remember, capillaries have very thin walls, which means that your body absorbs the oxygen and your body gets rid of the CO2. So now the blood going from the capillaries back into the veins now have oxygen poor blood because they've lost the oxygen, but they have a lot of carbon dioxide. So now that blood coming back is going to have what's drawn here as blue, but it's not really blue. It's like a really dark red. And that blood is going to go back to the right side of the heart. And again, the job of the right side of the heart, which has this oxygen poor blood, is to actually send it to the lungs. You can see it being sent to the lungs, either the left lung or obviously the right lung. And again, we know that the capillaries, which are surrounding the alveoli, they're going to pick up oxygen and they're going to get rid of CO2. So they're going to become oxygen rich. So if you think about the capillary in the alveoli, they are going to pick up oxygen and they're going to get rid of the CO2. There's your gas exchange. They're going to become bright red in color because the hemoglobin becomes bright red in the presence of oxygen. And that blood then is going to return from the left or right side of the heart to the left side, sorry, from the right or left side, left lung to the left side of your heart. Remember, we talked about the division of labor, left side of the heart. Its job is to send that beautiful oxygen-rich blood pretty much everywhere, except for your lungs, obviously. And the right side is supposed to send the oxygen-poor blood to your lungs. So there's actually different pathways. So if we were to summarize it, you could say there's a pulmonary circuit, which is from the heart to the lungs, back to the heart. There's something called a systemic circuit, which is the heart to basically everywhere else. And then there's your cardiac circuit, which is the circulation within the heart itself. So you'll notice that you can see these arteries and veins in the heart itself because the heart is actually supplying its own little circulatory pathway. That's one. That's called the cardiac circulation. But the other two are here. So you can see the pulmonary circuit is highlighted in, I guess it would be like this light yellow. And systemic circuit is in green. But just to summarize, the pulmonary circuit would be, again, from the right side of the heart, RSH, to the lungs. And that would then go to the left side of the heart. That's your pulmonary circuit. Whereas your systemic circuit would be from the left side of the heart to pretty much the rest of your body, except for the lungs, and then obviously back to the right side of the heart. Okay, that's the other pathway. this is an image of cardiac muscle. Remember, it kind of looks like skeletal muscle. You go back to your slides on the different types of tissues. Remember, we looked at the three: smooth muscle, cardiac, and skeletal. Cardiac kind of looks like skeletal, although there's a big difference between the two. This is an image showing you electrical activity. So this is when your heart is contracting. This is called an EKG, which stands for electrocardiogram. EKG, you've probably seen these a lot, like on medical shows. This means that your heart is contracting, right? And you can see, so this from here to here would be one complete cycle. But we'll talk again more about that in terms of how it works, what's actually going on. That's more of a grade 11 topic, okay? So I think I'm gonna stop there and take any questions.